Good evening and welcome everybody to Senate House. My name's Emma Bridges and when I'm not channeling Hecate, I'm usually the Public Engagement Fellow here at the Institute of Classical Studies. It's great to see so many of you here for a magical evening. I'm really glad I'm not the only one who turned up in costume. Now the magic you're going to see tonight might not be what you are expecting. We haven't got any rabbits in hats and we haven't got any card tricks. But instead, among other things, we're going to be sharing curses and spells and divining the future. And with any luck, our resident Circe will be turning humans into beasts. So this is how it's going to go. The first hour is going to consist of some short talks by our fantastic guest speakers, all of whom are experts on magic in its various forms. Each talk will last for about 15 minutes. The speakers won't be taking questions between the talks, but several of them are staying around until later, so you're more than welcome to come and have a chat to them in the second half of the evening. From 7 p.m, you're then going to be invited to explore some ancient magic for yourself by taking a look at some of the hands-on activities and displays that our colleagues have put together around the room. There'll also be some drinks outside in the crush hall of the soft and non-soft varieties during that time as well, and we'll wrap up at 8 o'clock. Couple of kind of housekeeping issues. If you are on Twitter, we would love it if you would tweet about the event either this evening or afterwards using the hashtag that we've been using, ICS Magic, because we'd love to hear your thoughts about the evening. And we've got one final plea. We're very keen here to ensure that our public events are relevant and interesting for the audiences who attend them. So if you did sign up via email, you'll receive a link tomorrow for a very short survey. We'd be hugely grateful if you could complete it just to help us inform our planning of future events. And there's also a small incentive to complete it in the form of a prize draw. But for now, I do hope you enjoy a magical evening with us, and it's time for me to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Helen King. Helen is Professor... Oh, sorry about that. What was that? Just weird. Helen's Professor Emerita in Classical Studies at the Open University, and she's an expert on ancient medicine, gender, and the history of the body. She's written books and articles on everything from midwifery to death and pretty much every stage of life in between. Tonight, Helen's going to talk to us about green stones, red wool, colour and touch in ancient Greek magic and medicine.
Thanks, Emma. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm a post-PowerPoint girl. I'm using your imaginations. That's the idea. Now, I'm quite excited to be here, not least because I want to hear what everyone else has to say, but also because I have an evil bug. I've had this for 10 days. It's been moving through my body systems. Just when you think it's done one, it then goes back to it again. And I feel somewhat death-like, which is sort of appropriate for Halloween. But nevertheless, I'm here, and I'm wondering, has somebody put a spell on me? Is there someone even now who has got a little doll of me and they're twisting bits of it? In which case, could you please lay off the sinuses? Because they've been going for quite a while now. And my sort of quest for explanation, why have I got this thing, is, I think, relevant to what I want to talk about today. My title, Green Stones, Red Wool, Colour and Touch in Ancient Greek Magic and Medicine, is supposed to make you think about the material culture elements of magic, the stuff that we use, the materials, the objects, the feel, the look, but also supposed to make you think a bit about magic and medicine. Where do we draw the line? Where do we go for our explanations? If one explanation doesn't work, where do we go to next? Where do we start with our explanations, and where do we stop? And I want to show you, by the end, that there is still magic in medicine today. Magic and medicine are always connected. Now then, green stones. Let's think about green stones. The 1st century AD writer Dioscorides, who wrote on the properties of various different materials, the medical properties, his book was called De Materia Medica, which is literally on medical materials, on the stuff that you use for medicine. But in that book, he mentions green stones as a medicine, sort of, saying that you can use them as an amulet, something you put on your body, to speed up delivery in childbirth. But Dioscorides, as someone who deals with the medicinal powers of substances is quite sniffy about amulets. And that tends to be the way ancient medicine goes. So 2nd century AD, Soranus talks about how women in childbirth often use amulets. He says they don't do anything, just fluff, really. But on the other hand, they are sort of soothing to the women who use them. So therefore, he says, don't stop women using amulets. So it's quite a sort of patronizing approach to this magical line that they don't actually do anything. But on the other hand, they're placebo. They make you feel better. You're trying to do something by hanging an amulet on yourself. And amulets do tend to get associated with women in the ancient world, which is another reason why we probably don't think about them. We don't have women's writings much, just a little bit of Sappho, the odd bit here and there. So we don't have anything to talk to us really about how amulets were used by women. They just turn up occasionally in male authors. One great example is in Plutarch's Life of Pericles, the great Athenian general. When Pericles was ill, we're told that the women hung amulets on him. So this image of Pericles like a giant Christmas tree, with things hanging all over him as people come in and hang another one on to see if that's going to do the job. Actually, no, it didn't. He died. Amulets, eh? So it's sort of what women do, and it's sort of, oh, well, if they must. The person, however, who really gets into the heart of magic and medicine and how the two are supposed to work is not one of the medical writers you'd expect. It's the biggie. It's Galen. Galen, the doctor to the Roman emperors in the 2nd century AD, who actually talks about what amulets do and how they work. He says that green jasper, it's green again, green jasper as an amulet is good for disorders of the stomach and the esophagus, the tube here. And he says, quote, I made a string of small stones of green jasper and hung it from my neck at such a length that the stones touched my esophagus. So think about that, they're touching, there's a physical awareness. You have to put them in the right place or they won't work, but you're actually putting them on the part that's affected. You're aware of them. You're thinking about the fact you're doing something to make yourself feel better all the time. And they work. Galen is very much in favor of green jasper for disorders of the stomach. This is in his book on simple medicines, and in the same text he also talks about an amulet made from the root of a plant, the peony. And that, he says, stops epileptic seizures. He tried that out on a boy who had epileptic seizures. He hung a peony root round the boy's neck. While it was there, the boy had no seizures. As soon as it was taken off, the boy had seizures. As soon as a fresh one was put back, he stopped the seizures. So Galen is aware of this power of objects, but he's not quite sure what you do about that. With the peony, he explains it by saying that the peony root has a particular quality, the quality of drying. And epilepsy and seizures go back to the Hippocratics as something that comes from phlegm. Oh, I know about that. Phlegm that comes down from the head and causes seizures. I haven't had those yet, so the night is young. So drying would be something that would cure seizures because phlegm is cold and wet. So you can see what's going on there. But he also talks a bit more about that green jasper. Galen says, the question in his mind is it the stone that has the quality, like the peony root actually has a quality? Or is it that people often put some sort of medicinal, magical symbols on the stone? Now, I saw that the PowerPoint that's showing at the back there has eventually, you don't need to look at it now because it's not doing it, but has quite a lot of these objects. If you want to see big, blown-up examples of ancient amulet figures. And often the stone's quite small, but someone has incised on it a magical words or a magical symbol, often the serpent swallowing its own tail, sort of symbol of infinity, I believe. But with the green jasper, it's usually a snake with 7 rays coming out from its head. And this is supposed to go back, Galen thinks, to ancient Egypt. So that's also quite interesting. It's got a sort of link to an alien culture, a sort of magical past, powerful culture that also gives it some potency. But Galen says, no, it's not the snake image. It's the stone. The material itself, just like with the peony root, the material itself has power. And he said he knows that because even if you use jasper without any inscriptions on it, it still works. So green jasper, powerful in childbirth, powerful for stomach and esophagus. I desperately need some of this material. I'm thinking about finding some tomorrow, actually. But green is also interesting. Green is a color that turns up in a lot of ancient medicaments. So no magic connection, just something which is used on the body to heal it, nothing magical. And what I think in a moment, I'll talk about what I mean by nothing magical. So green is often used for eye ointment in the ancient world. Not always, there are also white ointments, but green is seen as somehow good for that. It's a color associated with life, with new life, spring, sort of growth. It's got those sorts of positive vibes to it for the ancient Greeks. And I think if anyone here has got a dreadful urge to do a PhD, I think there are still more lurking around there, more topics to do with color that we really haven't gone to. You know, there's a book on color in the ancient world. There's a lot more that we could do on how the ancients think about color and its power. Now then, so green may be new growth, therefore health, possibly. But there's also evidence that when you put an amulet on, as opposed to when you applied eye ointment, when you put an amulet on, you also said a spell. There was something that you said that therefore the person you were doing it to heard, so another sense, the sense of hearing is being evoked. So you said something which somehow gave the thing its power. Was it the chant that was thought to make it work? Well, Galen would say no, the material itself has power. But if you had the combination of something you feel, you touch, you're aware of on your body, it's been applied with magical words which you don't necessarily understand, but they clearly sound good, is that going to help you to feel that something's being done for you? There's one possibility that with stones, those that were easily ground up will be more likely to be taken orally. You would take them in liquid and swallow them. That the harder ones are the ones you wear as an amulet, but I won't go there, we haven't got time for that. There are also some sources from late antiquity that talk about thread, however, and I want to come to that red wool now. Thread is interesting. There's one text, a very late source, a scholiast on Gregory Nazianzus, saying that old women, foolish old women, tie bits of coloured thread around wrists, arms, and necks. Again, I go back to that image of Pericles festooned with amulets, little bits of thread everywhere. We do thread now. We do bracelets. We do friendship bracelets. We do all sorts of thready things. But what's fascinating about the red wool in particular is that the source for it that we have comes from a medical text, not from a magical text in ancient Greece. And this is from the Hippocratic treatises, probably 5th century, 4th century BC, where amidst all the different pieces of stuff that you use to give in drinks and injections and bathe people in, suddenly just casually comes in to prevent complications in childbirth, use the fruit of a wild cucumber covered in wax and wrapped in red wool and tie it to the thigh. Now, when Anne Hansen, great scholar of ancient medicine, spotted that one, it was a bit of a moment. A magical remedy. There's no attempt to explain how it works in any other way than to say, it's an amulet, tie it on, it helps. Unlike later medical texts, Soranus, Dioscorides, there's no, oh, well, it doesn't really work, but women like it, so just let them do what they want. There's none of that. It's just there with exactly the same status as all the other herbal remedies that are in that text. It's just there. Now that's tricky because the Hippocratic texts on women were seen as very inferior, non-scientific, not worthy of the great Hippocrates, generally sort of for hundreds of years. They were just considered irrelevant. They were all about bodily bits and women's bits. Don't like that. Just irrelevant, not interesting, not scientific medicine, not what the father of medicine wrote. But in the 80s, people started to read them again, in the 1980s, and started to realize they're an amazing source for beliefs about women and for women's practices in the ancient world. Which raises questions like, what sort of texts are they anyway? Are they women's kitchen medicine that you hand down from mother to daughter, and then suddenly someone writes it down? Or are they kind of weird, freaky ideas that ancient Greek men come up with to explain why women are just weird? The jury's out. Aline Roussel, French scholar, argued it was handed down mother to daughter, and Paolo Banuli, the late Italian scholar, argued it was actually men's insanities, really, that were somehow encapsulated in these texts and projected onto women. We don't know. Probably both. I mean, you know, the fact women actually take the advice implies there's some sort of shared model of the body there. And Chris Faraoni, writing about ancient magic, came up with a really interesting comparative piece from a tablet from northern Iraq from about 1000 BC. If a husband is angry with a woman, you should weave together into a single strand, don't try this one at home, the tendons of a gazelle, hemp, and red wool. Tie it into 14 knots. Every time you tie a knot, recite the incantation. The woman places this cord around her waist, and she will be loved. Fab remedy. So I like this point about tying the knot, saying the incantation. It's somehow bringing the words of the magic into the material of the magic. Now, there's loads of other red things in Hippocratic gynecology. There's red plants, there's red suet, there's red arsenic. Oops. And clearly all this redness in Hippocratic gynecology is meant to make you think of blood, of women's menstrual blood as the material that creates a new baby, as the material that must flow every month, otherwise the woman is going to get sick. And it's about using one color to restore another, which sort of fits with green. And if green is about health and vitality, you use green to restore moisture and to restore vitality. So green eye ointment, you know, in order to make those eyes sort of less dry, more lovely. But I wanted to say one more thing before I finish. And this is, none of this is actually weird and what they do. It's also what we do. There's some really interesting social anthropology work on us. Not some tribal group in another culture, but us, Western civilizations, which looked at what people think about when they're given medications by their doctor. They asked people to rate whether they thought this was more powerful or less powerful than that. And they came up with this: red is powerful. Red pills, whoa. If you're given red pills, you know it's serious. If you're given red pills, you know you're going to get better. White, ugh. Who cares about white? Red, it's the stuff. Multicolored, actually even more powerful. Multicolored, whoa, I'm going to get better. And capsules, always better than pills. I mean, injections better than capsules, but capsules better than pills. So if your doctor gives you red capsules, wow. Now, how far is that us? Why do we have that thing about red? Now, coming here, you look at traffic lights, red, yellow, green, red, bad, stop, danger, green, go, good. But green stones, red wool. How can you apply what we think to what the ancients think? Can you? Is there some sense in which the colors being used also are somehow ranked in the ancient world in terms of what their potency is likely to be? So I leave you with those thoughts, and I'm desperately keen to hear what everybody else has to say, and I'll be around to talk to you afterwards. So that's my bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I predict a run on sales of red wool and green jasper after tonight. Our next talk is going to be delivered by two speakers, Dr. Thalia Sanchez Natalias and Dr. Gabriel Bedard. Thalia's travelled from Spain to be with us this evening. She's from the University of Zaragoza. For her PhD, she examined curse tablets from the Roman West, and she's currently also working on a book on the same subject. Gabriel's based here at the Institute of Classical Studies, where he researches the use of digital tools to study the ancient world. While these days he spends most of his time thinking about the magic of technology, however, his PhD did focus on ancient Greek representations of magic. Tonight, Gabby and Thalia are urging us to be careful with their talk on magical figurines and written curses.
Thanks, Emma. Great. Cool. So thank you very much, and good evening. So we're going to talk, as Emma said, about written curses and magical figurines, actually the opposite order from the title. I'm going to talk briefly for a few minutes to start with about curses and particularly the ways in which I believe the ancients were very, very careful to specify what curses were, who they were targeted at and what they did, and not to be sort of sloppy and risk making a mistake and risk cursing the wrong person or cursing them too strongly. So I'll start very quickly with a couple of words about what we mean by curse. Curse, in the context we're talking about, curse tablets and magical figurines and other objects that are used as for cursing, we're very specifically talking about these objects of which we have physical archaeological remains, which often are made of lead or some similar material, but that they were part of a bigger ritual. We know sometimes a little bit about this ritual from written texts, but most of the time we don't know what the rest of this ritual was. Almost certainly there were words spoken over this curse, as well as the words that may or may not have been written on it. And so we just have to bear in mind that the physical object that we have, is the reason we know about this, was only part of this ritual. And so a curse, as far as we can tell, was a ritual of some kind and an object, as Helen was saying, an object that is imbued with sort of spoken power as well as its intrinsic power, that was used either for protection or in some way to assert power over somebody or over an event. And there were various different contexts in which these curses were used, and we have examples of all of these kinds of curses: legal curses, curses related to gambling, sport, love, and so forth. I want to start, though, by talking about a couple of mythological instances of curses, because, as we know, when something appears in myth, especially if it appears in Greek tragedy, that's usually because something's gone wrong, badly wrong. And so I'm going to talk about curses that go wrong, just to illustrate how clearly in the ancient world curses were dangerous. The first is an example from the Oedipus Rex, the story of Oedipus, who, while king of Thebes, discovered that the city was under pollution because of the person who had killed the previous king Laius. We all know that was him, right? Not only was he didn't know Laius was his father, he also didn't know that he had killed Laius. So he starts out with by making a curse, a ritual curse against this unknown murderer, and he said, may this murderer lose his eyes and lose his entire family and be driven out of his homeland, and all these terrible things happened to him. It turned out to be him. It all happened to him. Right? That wasn't what he intended, presumably. The second example, also from Greek tragedy, this from a play called The Phaedra, which you may be familiar with. In this, Theseus's son Hippolytus is falsely accused of assaulting Theseus's second wife, and Theseus, very angry at his son, curses him to be torn apart by wild horses and killed. He then, although he is innocent, he is torn apart by his own horses while attempting to flee the country and killed. This is, again, a curse gone wrong. He was innocent, the curse killed him anyway. We'll come back to that. So curses are clearly dangerous. You can tell that the ancients thought curses were dangerous because whenever we have talk about curses, we see examples of people being very specific about who is being cursed and under what conditions they're being cursed. So the first of the three examples I want to give is the example of the conditional curse, and the most common example of this is in an oath, where you make a curse against yourself if you break your oath or if your oath is untrue. This is a way of saying, clearly I am telling the truth because I wouldn't curse myself with all these terrible things if I were lying. So this is the exact equivalent of saying, cross my heart and hope to die, right? You're cursing yourself if if you were lying. So it's a conditional curse. Only if you are lying, the curse happens. Second example is the indefinite curse. This happens particularly in curses, quite often in legal curses or curses in cases of theft. In this example, a curse tablet from Roman Britain, somebody had 2 wheels and 4 cows and a few small belongings stolen, and they didn't know who had stolen them. So when they're cursing, they say, whoever stole these things will be cursed in all these ways, whether it's a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, a slave or a free. We don't know who it was, but we're cursing them. So the gods decide who to curse because the gods do know who it was, presumably. The third example is the potential curse, and this is an example which is particularly evident on gravestone curses, and there's many examples of this from the ancient world, but I've chosen here an example from the early modern world. This, if you don't recognize it already, is the grave epitaph of William Shakespeare, and the last line of that says, "Cursed be he that moves my bones." No one has moved his bones yet in the last 400 years, because none of us want to be cursed. So it clearly was a useful protection. So he's not cursing any particular person, he's using this curse to protect his bones from that curse. And the final way in which the ancients were very specific about who they cursed and in what conditions is to identify the person involved or persons involved in the curse very, very specifically. So in this curse tablet, the author identifies themselves very specifically, Alexander, also known as Macedonius, whose mother was Matidia, and curses 2 opponents, Theodorus, there may be many people called Theodorus, so Theodorus the governor, that's clearly only one person, and the other Timon, whose mother was Marcia. Again, very specific who that person was. So just to come back to my 2 mythological examples, what would have happened if the people who cast those curses in these 2 stories had been more careful in what they were doing and had cursed conditionally or indefinitely rather than just dangerously as they did? Well, Oedipus was actually, although he didn't know it, was actually guilty, so he'd been screwed either way. In Hippolytus' case, if Theseus said, "Whoever assaulted my wife, may they be cursed and torn apart by wild animals," well, nobody did, because it was a false accusation, so nobody would have been cursed. It would have been a safe curse. So the moral of the first half of this story is simply be careful. When you're cursing, and we'll be doing some cursing later if anyone wants to, just be very specific about what circumstances you're cursing in. I'll hand over to Celia.
Thank you. Hi, hello everybody. So, when you think of Voodoo Doll, you may think of a range of things, from Halloween costumes to t-shirts, or even customized gingerbread men cookies to rituals that come from very distant countries. To this list, though, we must add the magical figurines that ancient populations, including Greek, Romans, or Egyptians, used to use. These figurines were closely related with cursed tablets, since both belong to the larger category of aggressive magic. But before continuing, I wanted to give you a warning that the first topic I will discuss here is sexual and contains some graphic imagery. Are we ready? Yeah? Okay. So, thanks to the Greek magical papyri, a collection of ancient magical spells, we know a fair amount about their manufacture. The most detailed account is found in a rather shocking love spell of attraction, which tells: take some wax or some clay and mold 2 figures, male and female. Arm the male one like Ares, holding a sword in his left and striking the female's neck on her right side. Put the female doll's hands behind her back and make her kneel. After counseling the lover to inscribe several magical words on different parts of the woman's body, this alarming recipe continues. Take 13 bronze needles and insert 1 of them into the woman's brain, 2 more into her eyes, 1 into her mouth, 2 below her ribcage, 1 into her hands, 2 into her vulva and anus, and 2 into the soles of her feet, while on each occasion saying once, I pierce X part of whoever, so that she may think of no one except me alone. It works. This recipe, which takes the common ancient association of sex and violence to an extreme, comes from the 4th century AD and describes this complicated ritual to a T. In fact, this constitutes the most meticulous ancient recipe for making a voodoo doll and is especially noteworthy since it finds a remarkable parallel in a figurine from Egypt, which you can see now on the slide. Wonderful. This figurine was found with a curse tablet whose text reads in part, "I deposit this binding spell with you, underworld gods. Rouse yourself for me and go to every district, every block, every house, and bind Ptolemais, to whom Aias gave birth, Ptolemais, the daughter of Origenes, so that she may not do anything that brings pleasure to any man, except for me alone, Sarapamon, to whom Area gave birth. Do not permit her to drink, to eat, to hold out, go out, or find a sleep apart from me, Sarapamon. Drag her by her hair, by her guts, until I have her, subservient to me for the full extent of my life, loving me, lusting after me, telling me what she has in her mind." What may be most surprising from our modern perspective is how such a violent imagery found in the spell and displayed in the figurine was thought of a way to preserve a woman and her chastity. This contrasts with many widely-held views about magical figurines, that they were used merely to kill victims rather than manipulate their behavior. Unlike the example of Egypt, though magical figurines are not usually discovered with a curse tablet that details the purpose of the spell. In fact, many of them only give us just one very short clue. So, the name of the victim. Oh well. As is the case with many brief curse tablets, the people who made these figurines likely recited formulaic spells while performing the ritual. In some cases, this lack of information can leave scholars at a total loss. So how do we interpret them? At times, a figurine's body language can be quite revealing. Different postures were used to express symbolically the aim of a given spell. And now, let's have a tour on some of those. So some figurines are shown standing with their arms stuck to their sides. The clay voodoo dolls from Puteoli that you can see on the screen are a good example. Here, the body language and comparison with the iconography and the text of some curse tablets tell us that someone wanted these victims to be immobilized and motionless. But to give another example, some figurines are shown with their hands behind their backs, which parallels ancient representations of prisoners. Two lead voodoo dolls from Etruria present a wonderful example of this type. In contrast, a pair of figurines could be portrayed embracing one another, as is the case from Cordoba. Here, in both cases, posters suggest that these are love spells, either to separate a couple or to bring a new one together. Unfortunately, though, we don't have any text to confirm these interpretations. So, as was the first case we saw, it is important to remember that the figurines could be found with other objects. At times, they were packed into special containers, like miniature sarcophagi or cinerary urns, in order to bury the target of the spell symbolically. This figurine of Severinus, perhaps a gladiator, is a great example of this. Severinus, who's depicted in the very act of being gulped down by a giant snake coiled around his body, who knows what he did. He was found inside of the 3 lead-nested containers. As if that were not enough, he was placed in the containers head down, which could metaphorically prevent him from escaping the curse. So, in this short talk, I've tried to show you a range of ancient magical figurines and explain some of the problems that we can have understanding them. But I haven't touched on the most important question. Do these figurines actually work? Well, that would be for you to find out during the hands-on activity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Gabby and Thalia. And as Thalia suggested at the end, you are invited after the talks to have a go at making your own cursed tablets and cursed dolls. And do let us know via the hashtag if they do work. Our next speaker is Dr. Sophie Page. Sophie's from University College London, and she's an expert on medieval magic and astrology, having published several books and articles on these subjects. She's also currently co-curating a fantastic exhibition entitled Spellbound at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So if you're inspired by tonight's activities, do go and see it. Tonight, Sophie's going to talk to us about magical thinking, past and present.
Props. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to take us forward in time, quite a long way. As I was introduced, I'm curating an exhibition at the moment that covers 800 years of magic and over 200 objects. When we put the exhibition together, we didn't want our visitors to think of magic as something strange and distant in the past and not something that we could think and feel about and practice today. So we thought about how to link it to the present. Obviously, magical practice continues, persecutions of witches and accusations of witchcraft continue, but we decided to link magical practices and ideas and beliefs in the past to magical thinking. So we think magically whenever we believe that our thoughts and wishes influence the world around us, or that one event happens as a result of another with no plausible link of causation. So we begin the exhibition, Spellbound, which is at the Ashmolean Museum, with 6 questions. We link them in the exhibition to particular objects. And what I'm going to do in this short talk is take you through the questions, linking them to magical objects in the past. The idea is that one of them hopefully resonates with you, maybe more of them, sometimes none of them. But they're the questions that we thought about when we were thinking about how people practice and think about magic in the past as well. So they are, do you have a lucky charm? Have you ever wondered about mysterious forces? Do little rituals make you feel less anxious? Can an object bind love? Could you stab the image of a loved one? And do you worry about tempting fate? So we start with, do you have a lucky charm? Magical thinking is a powerful applied fantasy, often worked out in rituals. An individual's way of thinking magically is very personal and can be influenced by many things, such as age, experience, and emotional state. Particularly at times of stress or in places where we are fearful, we may become preoccupied with lucky or unlucky numbers, colors, objects, words, and rituals, linking them to good or bad things that have happened or may happen to us. We chose this object on the far left for an object to present with the question, do you have a lucky charm? Because it epitomizes many medieval and early modern ideas about the struggle between good and evil. This is St. Michael the Archangel defeating the devil, a moment in the struggle between good and evil that for medieval people epitomized a moment of good winning. It's a religious image that would have been very familiar to people, but it's also carved in coral, and red coral, tying in very nicely to the first talk. The redness of coral was an important element in the belief in its efficacy and its protection, and medieval people had many ancient texts like Pliny telling them that it had these important protective and healing powers. In medieval Europe, it was tied to the protection of children in particular. And here you have one of many, we could have many examples of the Virgin and Christ wearing a coral necklace. Luck is important, particularly when we are facing difficulties. We know that from modern studies that soldiers are more likely to practice rituals, to have amulets. In this period, children were often associated with the wearing of lucky objects, and you have a selection of objects here. A fragment of unicorn horn, a toad leg, a crystal. And the objects might change, but the idea that we can change our luck, that we can increase the possibility of having good luck hasn't changed very much. So I've got a couple of magical objects. This is a Shire horse horseshoe, which I found in a boot sale in Norfolk in the summer. And it's clever because magical belief has to work with something familiar, and the idea of the horseshoe as something lucky is something very familiar in our culture, but then it has to present an idea of specialness. So it was £3, has been marketed as a lucky Shire horseshoe. So it's a special horseshoe because it's larger than normal, as well as having sort of evocative signs of age. And the one we have in the exhibition, similarly, a horseshoe to get into an exhibition has to have something special and evocative about it, and we have one here wrapped in velvet. We know from psychology that if we believe in the power of a lucky object, it can actually give us confidence to behave better in a test or a sporting contest. So the sense of control produced by ritualistic behavior can be psychologically comforting when we experience strong physical or mental pressure. The second question is, have you ever wondered about mysterious forces? This is quite a vague question, and a flippant answer can be, well, I'm interested in electricity or gravity. The reason we asked this question in this format is because a US study showed that if you put it in a questionnaire about the supernatural, rather vague terms, people were much more likely and more willing to say yes. If you ask specifically about fairies, ghosts, aliens, spirits, people would say no. But the idea that something might be out there was very intriguing. And a lot of medieval magical ritual is based on this idea of ambiguous, unknowable forces that we can potentially contact and persuade or compel to help us. So medieval people thought of themselves as living in a world swarming with vast, invisible numbers of spirits. But in fact, there was very little specific detail about them because the church was worried that cults of angels might overtake ideas of the omnipotence of God. But there are two strong ideas. One is that angels had a role to help humans and could act as messengers. And the other is that demons could be controlled by humans, specifically through the mainstream church ritual of exorcism, which was about expelling a demon that was possessing someone. So in magical rituals, and I'm defining magic here as a practical art that claims to offer the tools to manipulate the cosmos. So that's a definition that can then be taken to different periods and cultures, because the idea is that it will manipulate whatever powers are thought to exist in the cosmos. In the Middle Ages, popularly angels and demons. So on the right, we have a mirror, the Mirror of Florin, which I have has been recreated here, and this will just be over there. This is an object relating to a ritual of demonic magic. Demonic magic rituals have, in the late Middle Ages, have clearly come out of the ritual of exorcism, because the first part of the ritual is about compelling the demon to work with you. So you summon it and invoke it to obey your commands, usually by calling upon God, Christ, the saints to help you. In the case of the ritual of the Angel of Florin, there's another interesting feature which feeds into this idea of mysterious, ambiguous spirits in the universe. Although Christian cosmology has a very strong dichotomy between good angels and evil demons, in magic text, you tend to find an interest in much more ambiguous or neutral spirits. So spirits that can be persuaded to help you and aren't entirely good or evil. So we know from other sources that Florin was a fallen angel, but not an entirely evil one. The ritual to summon Florin uses a virgin boy, the invocation of the names of God. The boy sits in a magic circle holding the mirror. while the magical practitioner throws up into the air milk, honey, and wine. And then the demon is supposed to appear in the mirror in the form of an armed knight and answer questions about the past, present, and future. So it's a divinatory ritual. Right, moving on to the third question. Do little rituals make you feel less anxious? From the sort of 200 objects that we've got in the exhibition, and magical objects are hard to find because they've had a ritual imbued into them, but they might be an ordinary object like a shoe. And also magic tends to be a marginal and secretive activity, which also makes survival more problematic. But a very large percentage are protective, which tells us that part of the reason for the ritual was to help people feel less anxious. We have an entire room in the exhibition of objects that were concealed within the walls of homes, in the attics, hidden in chimney places under floorboards, and then ritually placed. And I'm going to... So two things here. One is that the anxiety is about natural disasters, fire, floods, vermin, as well as witchcraft and the supernatural. So we have a spectrum of anxieties that aren't simply to do with the cosmological forces in the world. The bull's heart on the left, I'm only going to talk about one of these rituals, but I'm happy to talk afterwards about the Bellarmine bottle on the right, is part of a ritual to protect the home against witches. And this relates to sympathetic magic. You take the heart of an animal that you believe has been cursed by a witch. When in the medieval and early modern idea of witchcraft, when the witch curses or enchants an animal or a person, part of her body enters into that animal or the person. So you can then protect your household by taking the body. It's a heart if it's an animal, it's a lemon or a potato usually if it's a human, or an onion, because they don't want to use a real human heart. And you pierce it with nails and you put it up inside a chimney so that the smoke from the fire is continuously harming the witch. This is a ritual that has a longue durée, and it's only in recent times that we've recovered these sort of often very shriveled hearts. And in some cases, up to 30 hearts of animals have been recovered from chimneys. So can an object bind love? Magical thinking is emotional. We think magically in response to desire, fear, guilt, anxiety, and joy, but also, perhaps most fiercely, as we've seen in the last paper, to love and hate. And one of the things I wanted to do in the exhibition was was to link medieval and modern objects. And one of the obvious ways to do this was with love locks. Even if we publicly express skepticism about magical thinking, it's been shown by research that we will engage in it when we think no one is watching. We will engage in it when there is most to lose or gain. So the person who's at the illusionist's performance might hand over a penny to be cut in half, but is more reluctant to hand over their gold watch to be hidden or lost or destroyed. And we also engage in magical thinking when it is rendered invisible because it is an accepted part of social or religious life. So the love locks on bridges in our modern cities are cumulative. There are now, when you see them, there are hundreds and hundreds. And so it's become something you can do, a ritual that is part of culture because so many other people are doing it. This is a collection that has, unfortunately, destroying the ritual of love, been cut off Leeds Centenary Bridge. But the ritual of the love lock is that you inscribe your names, usually with an inscription that relates to what you want from the ritual. You lock it on the bridge, you throw the key into the river. So both symbolically, but as a ritual action, it's intended to ensure the longevity of love. What I've done with some of my research is to look at medieval objects, jewellery linked to love as well, and the inscriptions on them. And the inscriptions on them aren't simply expressions of romantic interest. they tend to have much stronger statements. Desire no other. Think of him through whom I am here. One time my desire will be mine. And lots of inscriptions relating to the hope that love will last forever. I wanted to mention briefly that there are rituals for love magic that actually relate very nicely to the previous paper as well, where you inscribe the image of the beloved on a tile and then you burn it. So there's a lot of the use of substitutes for people. This is one which has been censored. It's got a page cut out and various names of the spirits that you're supposed to call on erased. This is to render it inoperable. So the person who owned this manuscript was interested in keeping the ritual, not destroying it entirely, but that no one else could practice it. And this is just to show that, because I'm going to come to a witch in a bottle, that the magician is threatening to put demons in a bottle if they won't help him make someone fall in love with him. Thanks. So substitutes of individuals is very common in religious practice as well as magical practice. This is a modern image of a wax figure with pins in it. But in the medieval period, we had relics, the body parts of saints. This is one in a sword. Votive figures, the offering of an image of the body in thanks to a saint for healing. And this is a heart that has been extracted from the body of someone who is wanting to separate their body parts in burial in order to enhance their chances of salvation by dispersing the parts of their body in different sacred places. This is from a cathedral in Ireland. I think even today, even when we know that there is no physical correspondence between a person and their image, the emotional connection created by an effective material substitute is very powerful. We delete photographs of our family, our loved ones, our friends all the time. Could you lift a knife and stab an image, a photograph of someone you loved? It's much harder, and I think makes more vivid the ancient and medieval rituals for working with an image, a bodily substitute for someone. The final question, which I'll just mention briefly, is do you worry about tempting fate? We have a ladder in the exhibition, and we've had about 15,000 visitors so far. What was very so the ladder is at the entrance, and you have to make a physical, proper choice about whether to walk under it or over it. It's sort of slap bang in the middle of the corridor. Everyone walks round it, pretty much, except for young men who are with their partners, which was very, very predictable. What surprised me more is that we also have in the exhibition this bottle from the Pitt Rivers Museum. It was obtained by a folklorist collecting in 1915 from an old lady living near the village of Hove, and she said, "They do say there be a witch in it, and if you let him out, there'll be a peck of trouble." And we have a sort of, one of the things on the questionnaire that we have for the exhibition is, would you open the bottle? And surprisingly, lots and lots of people say, no, we don't want the bottle to be opened. That's more surprising to me than the ladder. Anyway, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for that tour through some intriguing objects. How long does the exhibition run for? Till January, so you've got time to catch it. So our final speaker for the evening is Ros Caveney, who many of you will know as a poet, author, and translator. She's published countless works, both of fiction and non-fiction. I think that if there are many classicists in the room, you might be particularly interested in Ros's new translation of the poems of Catullus, which was published last month. Tonight, Ros is going to introduce and read some extracts from her novel Resurrections, which is a third book in her Rhapsody of Blood series.
I'm a novelist which means I make things up. And there's a sense in which everything we know about magic, everything we know about religion, is to some extent a product of someone's mind, even if you believe it to be true. The Rhapsody of Blood books were my attempt to write a big fantasy novel that wasn't set in a secondary world, like Westeros or Middle-earth, that was set in our world and that was set in actual history or a version of it, rather than stuff that was all made up from scratch. It's had its origins partly in the work I did on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because I got interested in that show for a whole bunch of reasons, one of which was, where does Slayer's power come from? And I decided, apparently quite wrongly, because that's not where the show went, that the woman who kills vampires, just as vampires steal life from their victims, by killing vampires, she absorbed that life, that power, into herself. And in terms of the show, I was completely wrong. But it gave me an idea. Because there's that wonderful quote of Nietzsche's about, if there were gods, how could I bear not to be a god? Therefore there are no gods. I was thinking about that and thinking about power and thinking about mythology and about various religions based on blood sacrifice. And I decided that one of the sources of godhood, mythologically, is mass murder. Whether it's the mass murder of animals that are sacrificed or the mass murder of human beings, which is why I wrote a whole section of the Rhapsody books, which is about the Aztecs, who committed mass murder and torture on an industrial scale in order to keep the sun alight. You understand, nothing personal. And so I created a character, the Huntress, whose job it is to punish anyone who achieves godhood by stealing it by mass murder. But of course, her immortality, her invulnerability, come from the fact that, as well as the protector of the weak, she's the top predator in the food chain and feels very bad about that. Now, playing around with these ideas, I needed to counterpoise it with some sorts of magic or quasi-magic that weren't horrible. At one point, my other heroine, a contemporary woman who gets caught up in this world, in the world of all of this secret world of mythology and demons, says, people talk of magic as a technology of will, as if that were a good thing. I wanted to find something less horrible, something less bleak, and I cast around. Now, I knew that a lot of the sections of this novel were going to be set in great mythic cities. So, French Revolution, Paris. Obviously, there's a section set in Atlantis. I got persuaded by my editor that I needed to write about Jack the Ripper, so Victorian London. I wanted to write about the classical world, but I didn't want to do Rome or Athens, because they're well-trod territory. I mean, I grew up on the Claudius books. There is a limit to what you can do with either imperial or republican Rome at this point. Whereas Alexandria, on the other hand, well, if I wrote about Alexandria, I could write about it in two periods. I could write about the post-Ptolemaic heyday. I could write about the decaying Alexandria of Christendom. I could write about Hypatia. And she gave the terrible things that were done to Hypatia gave me some ideas. But the other thing about Alexandria, particularly first century Alexandria, as I cast around and did my reading, was I came across Jack Lindsay's very good book on what it is wrong in the first century to refer to as alchemy. Because, of course, alchemy is not what was done in first century Alexandria. Because alchemy is from the Arabic al-Chem, which means Egypt. Alchemy is the thing that they do in Egypt. And of course, the Arab scholars from whom medieval European alchemy derived were themselves working at second hand with a bunch of texts written in the 3rd and 4th century in an attempt to understand what had gone on earlier. And of course, and this is relevant to what Helen was saying earlier, the 3rd and 4th century scholars and the Arabic scholars were men writing about work that had been done by women. Because all of the great names of early versions of the work, which I'll call the work, but you hear that as alchemy, the work were the three great names are Maria the Jewess, Cleopatra, not the Queen, and Maria of Egypt. Maria of Egypt, of course, is the person who's remembered for a useful kitchen device, the bain-marie. Because the whole point about what they were doing was that, yes, they were trying to achieve the various substances, but they were also working not just with precious metals, but with other minerals, but also with plants. Interestingly, though Cleopatra II, the Cleopatra of history, wasn't the same person as Cleopatra, who's remembered as one of the founders of the work. Cleopatra, who was one of the founders of the work, was presumably one of her relatives because it's a Ptolemaic dynastic name. And Cleopatra the Queen is recorded to have written treatises, now lost, on poisons and on cosmetics and perfumes, which are, of course, how she won the heart of Mark Antony, allegedly, and Caesar, allegedly. What is also important about first century Alexandria, and its relevance to all of this, is that first century Alexandria, and Alexandria for some years further to come, was a center of the glass industry. Glass technology was developed in Ptolemaic Alexandria and colossally improved. They exported glass, both glass objects and crude glass, all over the known world. There's, if a few years ago you saw the Scythian exhibition at the British Museum, there were a number of carved glass objects which were made from glass imported to the Hindu Kush and beyond from Alexandria. So the trade went all the way down the Red Sea and up through and back up. This meant that for the first time, people could blow the retorts, the athanors, the various glass things you use for improved versions of distilling. Now, one of my characters, I should explain, my heroine, the huntress, is one of three sisters who at the dawn of time are obliged by a god to choose their destinies. And one of them, her sister Soph, the other one being Lilith, Soph chooses to understand the workings of time and chance. She, in fact, becomes the incarnation of wisdom. And of course, as we know from our cultural history, wisdom is always dies and is always reborn. So Soph crops up in Mara's life from generation to generation, and sometimes they meet and sometimes they don't. And because I'm a novelist and I can do what I like with things, various of Soph's incarnations are Diotima, the woman who taught Socrates everything he knew, and indeed both Marys, Mary the Jewess and Mary of Egypt. And of course, because in my version, Mary of Egypt is living in the 1st century, she's also the person remembered as Mary Magdalene, because I'm a novelist, I can do anything. Ha! Anyway, I wanted to read to you a couple of bits about the work in the 1st century, and then I'll end up by reading a show-off bit about Alexandria, because I feel like it. For this is the great secret of the work, which I tell you for nothing, and never told Newton, for it would not have served the world well to do so. The steps of the work have, as is well known, to be performed in order, and some steps need to happen in the mundane world, and some in shadow. As above, so below, you know that formula. And yet, in shadow first, then in the light, and then in shadow. That formula is lost, with Paul of Tarsus's phrase, almost only the memory of it, in a glass darkly. That is how the work is done, and then face to face with light. And omit those steps or do them in the wrong order or the wrong realm, and all is undone and forever undoable, and you undone too in all likelihood. Soph, or Maria as she was known in this life, has spent lives working through this truth, and many of her deaths have been the source of that knowledge. Hers, and those of her sisters in the art, like Cleopatra, who was not a queen, and Cleopatra, who was. She knew all metals and many elements, and she knew every herb that grew in the parts of the world where she had spent her lives, and the parts of shadow into which she had walked. And that too was the secret of the work. As in metal, so in flesh and flower. The quest is for the perfect thing, and the perfect thing is metals that grow into flower and life that does not end. Soph had befriended the lad. If he's going to heal people, she said, he had best learn more about how bodies are made and perhaps not use his powers for trivial matters, but learn some actual herbcraft. Philo had been as concerned as we had at the damage Josh had done to himself by healing the legate, and agreed to the youths coming across the city for instruction. Josh brought his brother, who was determined to watch over him but had no interest in healing. Soph taught Josh much about medicine and much about her work, and of the herbs from shadow and the mundane world that she used in both. For the violets that grow in those far fields first intoxicate and then purify the blood, and the garlic you pluck there oozes a salve that is good for warts. She knew all herbs and plants and the different properties, and she knew how to filter and distill them alone or together and make the veins of the and arteries of the body sleep or dance. And I did eventually have to do a sort of version of the medieval version of the work, but not quite as... She told me of that work which is now called alchemy and deeply misunderstood because its practitioners know nothing of shadow. They might achieve the elixir, which in shadow is the first Azoth, but nothing else of note, neither in the self-forming that is a part of the practice, nor its rewards, which are also its stages. That is the elixir, which sometimes prolongs life and sometimes blasts it, because it is as fickle as the mercury, which it changes into that other metal, which is known as the adamant, unbreachable by any force, yet as ductile and shapeable as clay. It is the perfect metal, save the gold of the work, which is not gold at all, but the child of the stone. Without the adamant to contain and control it, you cannot transform aqua regia and aqua fortis into that which dissolves, the alkahest as the Arabs call it. Or without the alkahest and the azoth, you cannot transform the adamant into the stone. And without the stone that changes the nature of all things, you cannot begin to achieve the quintessence, the gold of the work, the child of the stone, and perfect wisdom, perfect knowledge of time and chance. Which, though I say it myself, is a better explanation of what alchemy is about than most medieval texts, because they never explain how you could make something which dissolves everything and what you keep it in. So I just made up another alchemical substance called the adamant, which makes everything make sense, doesn't it? Not really, no. But it will do for a novel. This, I'm afraid, is the point at which I'll leave that bit of the novel, because there is a alchemical saying I made up, which turns out to be extremely sinister and very horrid, and it's that what is done with the work can only be undone with the work. And with that slightly sinister thought, I will leave you.
Thank you so much, Ros. It's always a huge pleasure to hear authors read from their own work. Now, before we move on to the second phase of the evening, where you have a chance to have a look at some magical objects and create some curses or whatever, or go and have a drink. And I'd like to, first of all, thank our speakers, but also all of our presenters this evening, our colleagues who are presenting at the back of the room, who you'll get a chance to talk to in a moment. Also to Gabby, particularly for all his efforts in co-organising this evening's event, and also to Valerie James of the Institute of Classical Studies, who's, as always, been a huge, huge source of support for the organisation. So if we could thank all of those people, including our speakers, that would be fantastic.